They laughed when the millionaire adopted 3 black girls, calling it a stunt, a phase, a mistake. But he gave up his empire to raise them, alone, far from the noise. What no one saw coming was how these abandoned babies would grow into forces the world couldn't ignore. Now, 20 years later, the same people who mocked them are begging for a seat at their table. So when family, fortune, and legacy collide, will love be enough to silence the past? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The grand ballroom of St. Agnes Orphanage stood in stark contrast to its everyday appearance. Crystal chandeliers had been brought in for the occasion, their light bouncing off the peeling paint of the walls. Jonathan Blake stood in the corner watching as Seattle's elite mingled, champagne flutes in hand. "Why do we even bother?" a woman in diamonds whispered nearby. "These charity cases never amount to anything." Jonathan adjusted his tie, uncomfortable in more ways than one. At 42, the tech billionaire preferred the solitude of his lab to these social obligations. But as CEO of Blake Innovations, certain appearances were expected. "Mr. Blake, we're honored you could attend," the orphanage director gushed, approaching with a nervous smile. "Your donation will fix our heating system before the worst of winter hits." Jonathan nodded politely, but his attention had already drifted across the room. In a makeshift playpen, far from the glamorous crowd, 3 tiny black baby girls lay bundled together on a thin blanket. Something about them, their isolation perhaps, pulled at him. "Who are they?" he asked, interrupting the director's chatter. "Oh," the director's enthusiasm dimmed. "Abandoned last week. Sisters, we believe. Zuri, Imani, and Noelle, according to the note left with them. Difficult placement, I'm afraid." Jonathan moved toward the babies as if drawn by an invisible thread. The smallest one, Zuri, according to her name tag, looked up at him with wide, solemn eyes that seemed too knowing for her tiny face. Suddenly, he was 8 years old again, huddled in a corner of another orphanage. The memory washed over him like ice water, the loneliness, the whispers that no one wanted the strange, quiet boy who built things instead of playing ball. Until Nurse May found him, her dark hands gentle as she wiped his tears, her voice warm like sunshine when she told him, "God gives special gifts to special children. Someday you'll understand why." May had been the only person who believed in him before he made his first million, before anyone cared who Jonathan Blake was. Looking at these 3 abandoned girls, something cracked open inside his chest. "Sir?" The director was staring at him strangely. "Would you like to rejoin the gala?" Instead of answering, Jonathan walked to the playpen and knelt beside it. The middle baby, Imani, reached out a tiny fist toward him. The third one, Noelle, kicked her feet excitedly. "I want to adopt them," he said, the words surprising even himself. A hush fell over the nearby guests. Then someone laughed. "All 3?" the director stammered. "But Mr. Blake, there are procedures, home studies." "I'll handle everything." Jonathan stood, suddenly certain. Camera flashes erupted as reporters recognized a story worth telling. Across the room, his assistant was already on the phone, likely calling an emergency board meeting. His publicist looked ready to faint. But Jonathan Blake, who had built an empire from nothing, who had everything and no one, felt peace for the first time in decades. "These girls," he said simply, "are coming home with me." The headline splashed across the New York Times business section the next morning. "Tech genius or just crazy? Blake adopts 3 orphans in bizarre PR stunt." Similar stories flooded every major news outlet within hours. Jonathan sat in his penthouse feeding tiny Noelle a bottle, while CNN played on mute. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Blake Industries stock drops 12% after CEO's impulsive adoption." "Sir," his assistant Mira handed him a tablet showing social media trends. "You're the #1 hashtag." "Crazy Blake." Jonathan barely glanced at it. "Are the nursery renovations complete?" "Yes, but there are 17 interview requests. The board is demanding an emergency meeting, and your publicist has drafted 3 different statements explaining." "I'm not explaining anything," Jonathan said quietly, his eyes on Noelle's tiny face. "They're my daughters now." That's all anyone needs to know. In the Blake Industries boardroom that afternoon, chaos reigned. Jonathan sat calmly at the head of the table, while Imani slept against his chest in a baby carrier. "This is corporate suicide," shouted Gerald Winters, his largest investor. "3 black babies? The public is calling it a publicity stunt gone wrong. Some are questioning your mental stability." "You need to issue a statement," insisted Sarah Chen, head of PR. "Explain that you've always wanted to be a father, that this is part of your charitable—" "I won't be using my daughters as PR props," Jonathan interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "Not now, not ever." "Your daughters?" Gerald's face reddened. "You've known them for 48 hours. "And I'll know them for the rest of my life," Jonathan replied simply. 2 weeks later, Jonathan stood in his emptied office holding Zuri while Imani and Noel dozed in their stroller. The panoramic view of Seattle's skyline gleamed in the rare winter sunshine. "The paperwork is complete," Mira said, handing him a folder. "Your resignation as CEO is official. The board has accepted your recommendation for Sarah as interim leader." "And the other matter?" "The estate in Vermont is ready. Very private, excellent schools nearby for when they're older. Your financial team has liquidated the shares you requested. It's more than enough to live comfortably forever, even with college funds for 3. Jonathan nodded, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Thank you, Mira. For everything." She smiled sadly. "They'll say you threw everything away." Jonathan looked down at Zuri's sleeping face, then at her sister's. "No," he said softly. "I'm finally finding what matters." That evening, a black SUV with tinted windows left Seattle, carrying the Blake family toward their new life, away from the cameras, the judgment, and the world that couldn't understand that some treasures were worth more than empires. The Vermont estate sat nestled among tall pines, its stone walls offering shelter from both winter winds and prying eyes. Inside, Jonathan Blake, the man who once commanded boardrooms with quiet authority, now faced his greatest challenge yet. "Please stop crying," he whispered to Noelle, pacing the nursery floor at 3 a.m. Her tiny face was scrunched up in discomfort, while her sisters somehow slept through the commotion. "I don't understand what you need." He checked her diaper again, clean. She'd refused a bottle. He'd tried burping, rocking, and even singing an off-key lullaby his mother had once sung to him. Nothing worked. "We'll figure this out together," he promised, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "I'm not going anywhere." By morning, dark circles shadowed Jonathan's eyes as he carefully measured formula into 3 bottles. Mrs. Winters, the elderly housekeeper he'd hired from the nearby town, watched with a gentle smile. "You're getting better at that, Mr. Blake," she observed. Jonathan sighed. 3 different babies, 3 different feeding schedules, 3 different ways they like to be held. I've designed operating systems less complex. Later that week, Jonathan sat on the phone with the pediatrician, frantically taking notes. "Yes, I understand about the rash. No, I've been changing them frequently. Yes, I'm using the sensitive formula for Imani." He rubbed his tired eyes. "Thank you, doctor." That night, when the house finally fell quiet, Jonathan slipped into his study. He pulled out a dusty box of VHS tapes labeled Parenting 101 and Baby's First Year that he'd ordered online. His state-of-the-art entertainment system had been modified to include a vintage VCR. As the grainy footage played, showing proper swaddling techniques, Jonathan reached for a silver frame on his desk. In it, a young black woman in a nurse's uniform smiled warmly while holding a small boy, himself at age 5. Nurse Clara had been the only one who'd shown him kindness during his years at Westlake Children's Home. "I wish you could see them, Clara," he whispered to the photograph. "I wish you could tell me if I'm doing this right." As months passed, a rhythm emerged in the Blake household. Jonathan planted a small garden outside the nursery windows, explaining to the girls as they grew into curious toddlers about each vegetable and flower. "This is lavender," he told Zuri, who reached out to touch the purple blooms with wonder in her eyes. "And these tomatoes will be ready soon," he explained to Imani, who watched everything with intense focus. Bedtime became sacred ritual. Jonathan would gather all 3 girls in the nursery's reading nook, surrounded by bookshelves he'd filled with diverse children's stories. "Once upon a time," he'd begin, his deep voice softening as 3 pairs of eyes gazed up at him. The mansion, once cold and empty, now echoed with tiny giggles and pattering feet. It had become a home. The summer of 2006 brought warmth to the Vermont estate, along with remarkable changes in the Blake household. Jonathan set up a video camera in the playroom one sunny afternoon, capturing moments he knew he'd treasure forever. "Daddy, look." 4-year-old Zuri held up her paintbrush, her small hands already covered in swirls of blue and purple. The wall behind her, which Jonathan had specially prepared with washable paint-friendly coating, bloomed with colorful handprints and abstract shapes. Her eyes shone with quiet intensity as she added careful strokes to her creation. Across the room, Imani methodically arranged stuffed animals and books on a small shelf. "They need to be in the right places," she explained seriously when Jonathan asked what she was doing. "The bears go here, and the books go in size order." Even at 4, her sense of order and justice showed in everything she did. Meanwhile, Noelle had dismantled a set of building blocks only to reconstruct them into an intricate tower that seemed to defy gravity. "It's a robot house," she announced proudly, adding another block to the precarious structure. "It has buttons that make food appear." Jonathan watched them through the camera lens, his heart swelling. Each girl so different, yet equally remarkable in her own way. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Jonathan brought a plate of orange slices out to the porch swing. The girls scrambled up beside him, fitting perfectly against his sides. "See those stars coming out?" He pointed to the darkening sky. "People used to use them like maps before we had computers." "Like your computers, Daddy?" Noelle asked, juice dribbling down her chin. "Sort of," he smiled, wiping her face with a napkin. "But much, much older." After tucking the girls into bed that night, Jonathan sat at his desk and opened a leather-bound journal. On the first page, he had written, "The family they never saw coming." His pen hovered over the blank page before he began writing. "Today I watched them become themselves. Zuri with her art, seeing beauty where others might miss it. Imani organizing her world with fierce determination. Noelle building impossible things simply because no one told her they were impossible." The shrill ring of his phone interrupted his thoughts. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in years: Gregory Vance. "Jonathan," Gregory's voice sounded strained. "I wouldn't call if it wasn't urgent. The company, your company, it's in trouble. The board is running it into the ground. The Blake algorithm project is failing without your oversight." Jonathan glanced at the hallway leading to the girls' rooms, their nightlights casting soft glows beneath their doors. "Gregory, I left that life behind," he said quietly. "I know," his former partner replied. "But they're dismantling everything you built. I thought you should know." As Jonathan hung up the phone, he didn't realize that across town, Gregory Vance was sitting in an upscale bar with several board members, a phone propped against a whiskey glass, still recording. "Can you believe Blake threw away everything for those kids?" Gregory slurred, loosening his tie. 3 random black orphans. They're nothing but parasites on Jonathan's legacy." The men around him laughed uncomfortably. "His algorithms could have revolutionized the industry," Gregory continued, his voice growing bitter. "Instead, he's playing daddy to charity cases that'll never understand what he sacrificed for them." What Gregory didn't notice was a young server hovering nearby, her phone discreetly capturing every word. By morning, the video had spread across every social media platform. Jonathan was in the kitchen making pancakes shaped like animals when his phone began buzzing incessantly. Texts, calls, and notifications flooded in. He picked it up just as Zuri padded into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy, can mine be a butterfly?" she asked, climbing onto a stool. Jonathan set his phone face down on the counter, forcing a smile. "Of course, sweetheart." Later, after the girls were occupied with their tutor, Jonathan retreated to his study and watched the video. His face remained expressionless, but his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. The media frenzy was immediate and vicious. Headlines screamed, "Blake's former partner calls adopted daughters parasites," and Racism Scandal Rocks Tech World. Comment sections filled with both outrage at Gregory and renewed mockery of Jonathan's decision. "Mr. Blake, we need to issue a statement," his rarely used PR team insisted over the phone. "This is an opportunity to—" "No," Jonathan said firmly. "No statements. No interviews." That night, after tucking the girls in, Jonathan sat at his desk with 3 cream-colored envelopes. On each, he wrote a name: Zuri, Imani, Noel. Inside each envelope, he placed a letter that began, "My dearest daughter, when you read this on your 21st birthday, I want you to know the truth about the day I found you. People will tell you I saved you, but the truth is much simpler. You saved me." His pen moved steadily across the pages as he poured out his heart, explaining how their presence had given his life meaning beyond wealth and success. He wrote about the emptiness he'd felt before them and the fullness they brought to his world. Jonathan sat at his desk, the 3 sealed letters before him, when a memory washed over him like a cold wave. Suddenly, he wasn't a billionaire in a countryside mansion, but a skinny 10-year-old boy, curled up on a thin mattress in the corner of yet another strange bedroom. The memory was so clear it made his chest ache. It was his 7th foster home in 3 years. The family had seemed nice at first, but within weeks, he'd become invisible to them. Just another government check. That night, after being forgotten at school for the 3rd time that month, he'd cried silently into his pillow. "Child, what's hurting that heart of yours?" The voice had belonged to Miss Dolores, a night nurse who checked on foster children in the district. She was tall with deep brown skin and eyes that seemed to see right through his pretend smiles. "Nobody wants me," Jonathan had whispered, the words tearing from somewhere deep inside. "I'm just extra. In the way." Miss Dolores had sat on the edge of his bed and done something no one had done in years. She'd gathered him into her arms, cradling him against her soft cardigan that smelled of lavender and safety. "Listen here," she'd said, her voice low and steady. "Some folks are too blind to see the treasure right in front of them. That's their loss, not yours." Jonathan blinked away the memory and opened his desk drawer. From a small wooden box, he removed a yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter he'd read so many times the creases were worn thin. Miss Dolores had pressed it into his hands the day he'd aged out of the system. "Family is not who shares your blood," the carefully written words reminded him. "It's who chooses to love you anyway. Remember this when the world feels cold. Somewhere, someone is waiting to call you theirs." Jonathan folded the letter carefully and returned it to its box. The house was quiet now, the only sound the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He rose from his chair and moved silently through the darkened house, stopping at the doorway to the girls' bedroom. In the soft glow of their nightlight, he could see all 3 of them sleeping peacefully. Zuri with her arms flung wide, Imani curled neatly on her side, and Noel halfway under her blankets, one foot sticking out. "They'll never feel what I felt," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. It wasn't just a promise. It was his life's purpose now. Never unwanted, never forgotten, never just a number in a system. He leaned against the doorframe, watching their tiny chests rise and fall. "I'll be the father I never had," he vowed silently. "The one who stays, the one who sees you." The next day dawned bright and clear. Jonathan stood at the kitchen window, watching sunlight filter through the trees surrounding their countryside estate. He'd kept the girls sheltered here for years, safe from prying eyes and cruel words. But they were growing up, and he knew he couldn't protect them from the world forever. "Girls, how would you feel about visiting the park today?" he asked during breakfast. 3 pairs of eyes widened in surprise. They rarely ventured into public spaces together. "The one with the big slide?" Noelle asked, practically bouncing in her seat. "Yes, that one." Jonathan smiled, though his stomach knotted with anxiety. An hour later, they walked through the community park entrance. Jonathan felt the stares immediately. Parents pulled their children closer, whispers following them like shadows. He gripped the girls' hands tighter, trying to focus on their excitement rather than the judgmental glances. Zuri noticed first, her sensitive nature picking up on the tension. She pressed closer to Jonathan's side. Imani's eyes narrowed as she caught snippets of whispered conversations. "Look at them," one mother murmured to another. "Such a strange family." "I wonder where the real mother is," came another whisper. Jonathan pretended not to hear, but his jaw tightened. He guided the girls toward the playground equipment, helping them climb and slide, determined to give them this normal childhood experience despite the uncomfortable atmosphere. A small boy with tousled hair approached them at the sandbox, looking curiously between Jonathan and the girls. "Are they really yours?" the boy asked bluntly, pointing at Zuri, Imani, and Noel. "My mom says you can't be their real daddy." Jonathan froze, unprepared for such a direct question. Before he could formulate a response, Noel stepped forward, hands on her hips. "Of course we are," she declared loudly, her voice carrying across the playground. "He's our daddy." The simplicity and certainty in her voice brought tears to Jonathan's eyes. The boy shrugged and asked if they wanted to build a sandcastle together. That evening, after tucking the girls into bed, Jonathan sat at his desk with a blank notebook. The day's events had stirred something in him. He began to sketch 3 little stars, each with distinct personalities. One sensitive and artistic, one principled and protective, one bold and inventive. His pen moved swiftly across the page as he wrote, "The 3 stars and the sky," the title flowing naturally. This would be his gift to them, a story that celebrated their uniqueness and the family they had created together. The years passed swiftly in their countryside haven. As the girls turned 12, their unique personalities blossomed like the wildflowers in Jonathan's garden. Imani, with her serious eyes and thoughtful demeanor, began devouring books about justice and law. Jonathan often found her curled up in the library window seat, engrossed in simplified courtroom dramas and biographies of famous judges. "Dad, did you know Ruby Bridges had to be escorted by federal marshals just to go to school?" Imani asked one evening, looking up from her book with fierce indignation in her eyes. "That's not fair." "No, it wasn't," Jonathan agreed, his heart swelling with pride at her sense of justice. Meanwhile, Zuri discovered the magic of colors. Her bedroom walls became her canvas, covered with swirling patterns and dreamlike landscapes. She painted her emotions, joy in yellows and oranges, sadness in deep blues, love in soft pinks. Her quiet nature found expression through her brushstrokes. Noelle, ever curious and energetic, turned the house upside down with her inventions. No broken appliance was safe from her tinkering hands. Jonathan came home one day to find the toaster completely dismantled on the kitchen table with Noelle hunched over it, small tools spread around her. "I fixed it, Dad," she announced proudly. "It wasn't toasting evenly because the heating element was crooked. I straightened it." Jonathan watched his daughters with wonder, recognizing gifts that deserved nurturing. Without fanfare, he began making calls. Within weeks, carefully selected tutors began visiting the estate. For Zuri, he found Ms. Eleanor, a gentle-voiced art teacher who specialized in emotional expression through painting. For Imani, he arranged sessions with Mr. Daniels, a retired civil rights attorney who taught her about landmark cases in simple terms. And for Noelle, there was Dr. Patel, an engineering professor who delighted in her mechanical curiosity. "You're giving them wings," Ms. Eleanor commented one afternoon, watching Zuri mix colors with newfound confidence. "I'm giving them choices," Jonathan replied softly. "Something I never had." That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, the mail arrived. Among the usual envelopes was an official letter from the city. Jonathan opened it in his study, his expression growing somber as he read. The Harmony Home Orphanage, where he had found his daughters 13 years ago, was closing due to lack of funding. Jonathan stared at the letter for a long time, memories washing over him. The cold winter morning, 3 baby girls abandoned in a corner. The decision that changed everything. With a heavy sigh, he folded the letter and slipped it into his journal, tucked between pages filled with stories of his daughter's growth. They didn't need to know yet. This place that had rejected them was disappearing, but the family they had built would remain. The following Monday, Jonathan drove the girls to Oakwood Academy, a prestigious private school nestled among tall oak trees. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as they pulled into the parking lot. The girls chatted excitedly in the back seat, but Jonathan's stomach knotted with anxiety. "Remember," he said, turning to face them, "education is your greatest tool. No matter what anyone says or does, you are there to learn." The main office smelled of fresh paint and old books. As Jonathan approached the front desk with the girls beside him, the secretary's smile faltered. She glanced at the girls, then at Jonathan, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice cool, "we weren't expecting you personally." While Jonathan filled out paperwork, he noticed the whispers. 2 staff members huddled by the copy machine, stealing glances at his family. "Just another publicity stunt," one whispered not quietly enough. "He'll be bored of playing daddy soon enough." Jonathan's pen paused mid-signature, but he didn't look up. For the girls' sake, he kept his expression neutral. In Zuri's classroom, the children sat in a circle sharing family drawings. When Zuri's turn came, she held up her painting with shy pride. It showed 4 figures, 1 tall white man and 3 black girls, standing beneath a rainbow. "This is my dad and my sisters," she explained softly. "We're a family." The teacher, Mrs. Peterson, took the painting with pinched fingers. "That's very colorful, Zuri," she said, her tone condescending. "Perhaps next time we can work on more realistic skin tones." Jonathan, observing from the doorway, felt his chest tighten. Zuri's shoulders slumped as she returned to her seat. That evening, Jonathan made a decision. While the girls did homework, he went through the house, disconnecting televisions and removing tablets. In their place, he began transforming unused rooms into creative spaces. Within weeks, the East Wing housed a recording studio where the girls could express themselves through music. The sunroom became Zuri's art studio, filled with easels and paints of every color imaginable. The old study transformed into a mini library and debate space for Imani, while the garage became Noelle's workshop. "Dad, why can't we watch TV anymore?" Noelle asked one evening. Jonathan knelt to her level. "Because I want you to create, not consume. The world isn't always kind to those who are different. Here, you can be yourselves without judgment." He watched as his daughters explored their new spaces, their faces lighting up with possibility. In this haven, they could grow strong before facing the world's cruelty again. The years passed quickly within the walls of the Blake estate. What had once been a lonely mansion transformed into a vibrant home filled with creativity and laughter. Each girl had found her passion, nurturing it in the safe spaces Jonathan had created. Noelle's workshop became a wonderland of wires, tools, and half-finished inventions. One evening, she burst into the dining room, her curly hair wild with excitement. "I did it!" she exclaimed, placing a sleek lamp on the table. "Watch this." With a few taps on her homemade remote, the lamp adjusted its brightness, angle, and even color. Now Imani can read without straining her eyes, and Zuri can see the true colors for her paintings, even at night. Jonathan beamed with pride. "That's incredible, Noelle." In the library, Imani stood tall, facing her history tutor with fierce determination. "But the Civil Rights Act didn't end discrimination," she argued, her voice steady and passionate. "It just made it hide in different forms." Her tutor, Dr. Reynolds, nodded thoughtfully. "You make a compelling point, Imani. Your understanding of legal nuance is remarkable for someone your age." Meanwhile, Zuri had transformed her bedroom wall into a breathtaking mural, a sprawling tree with 3 branches reaching toward a golden sun. Hidden within the leaves were symbols representing each family member. "It's us," she explained quietly when Jonathan stood in her doorway, speechless. Growing together, reaching for the light. Their peaceful routine shattered one crisp autumn afternoon when the security system announced a visitor. Jonathan froze when the camera revealed Gregory Vance's expensive car at the gate. "Stay inside," he told the girls firmly before walking out to meet his former business partner. Gregory stood on the driveway, hands in his pockets, a practiced smile on his face. "Jonathan, old friend, you look well." "What do you want, Gregory?" Jonathan's voice remained calm, but his posture was rigid. To apologize. Gregory's smile didn't reach his eyes. What I said years ago was unforgivable. I've been reflecting on my mistakes. As they spoke, the girls watched curiously from an upstairs window. Gregory glanced up, catching sight of them, and his smile widened slightly. "Beautiful girls," he commented. "They must be quite special to have captured the great Jonathan Blake's heart." Jonathan stepped into Gregory's line of sight. "They are, and they're the reason I'm asking you to leave now." After Gregory's departure, Jonathan immediately called his security consultant to upgrade the estate's protection systems. That evening, he sat at his desk, journal open, carefully revising his will with his attorney on speakerphone. "Each girl receives an equal third," he instructed, "with provisions for education, health care, and full access to their inheritance at 25. He glanced at the framed photo of his daughters on his desk. No one, especially not Gregory Vance, would threaten their future. The talent show began as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the living room. Jonathan sat in his favorite armchair, a mug of tea warming his hands as the girls prepared their surprise performances. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Noel, using a hairbrush as a microphone, "welcome to the first annual Blake Family Talent Spectacular." Zuri went first, setting up her easel with a canvas covered by a small cloth. She worked with quick, confident strokes, occasionally glancing at Jonathan with a shy smile. After 15 minutes, she stepped back and revealed a striking portrait of Jonathan, not as the world saw him, but as they did. Kind eyes crinkled at the corners, a gentle smile, and shoulders that carried them through storms. "It's how we see you, Dad," Zuri explained softly. Before Jonathan could respond, Imani stepped forward in a makeshift judge's robe, fashioned from a black blanket. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Imani Blake," Noel called out. Imani presented a mock case about a fictional company that had polluted a community's water supply. She argued both sides with impressive clarity, then delivered a thoughtful verdict that balanced punishment with rehabilitation. "The law must protect people, not just profits," she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. Jonathan wiped a tear from his eye as Noel bounded forward with something hidden behind her back. "And now," she announced dramatically, "meet Dadbot." She revealed a small robot constructed from spare parts. With a press of a button, the robot's eyes lit up blue. "Good morning, Jonathan," it said in a tinny voice. "Your daughters are brilliant because you believe in them." Then it rolled forward and offered a small mechanical hand. "It says a different nice thing every day," Noel explained proudly, "so you always remember how awesome you are." Just as Jonathan was embracing all three girls, the doorbell rang. A delivery driver had left a package on the porch. Inside was a beautifully illustrated children's book titled The 3 Stars and the Sky. "No author," Imani noted, examining the cover. They settled on the couch together, and Jonathan watched nervously as they turned the pages. The story followed 3 brilliant stars, one that painted beauty, one that fought injustice, and one that built amazing things, all guided by a loving moon. Zuri gasped first. "This is us," she whispered, pointing to the illustrations that subtly captured their likenesses. "Dad?" Imani looked up at Jonathan, her eyes wide. "Did you write this?" Jonathan nodded, suddenly shy. "I wanted to show the world how special you are." "You published a book about us?" Noel bounced excitedly. "That's why you were locked in your office so much." The girls tackled him with hugs, the book carefully placed on the coffee table. "We promise to be everything you see in us," Zuri whispered. "And more," added Imani firmly. "Way more," Noel declared. "Just you wait and see." The phone buzzed in Jonathan's pocket just as the girls were packing away their talents and treasures. He stepped into his study, closing the door quietly behind him. "Mr. Blake, I'm afraid I have your test results," Dr. Michaels said, his voice heavy with professional concern. "There's evidence of early-stage heart complications. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but we need to start treatment soon." Jonathan's fingers tightened around the phone. "How soon?" "Within the next month, we'll need regular monitoring, medication, possibly some lifestyle changes." Jonathan glanced through the window at his daughters laughing in the living room. Their 16th birthday was just weeks away. "I understand," he said calmly. "Send the details to my secure email. And doctor, complete discretion, please." He hung up and took a deep breath, pushing the diagnosis to the back of his mind. Not now. Not when they were so happy. Earlier that day, while Jonathan was in the shower, Noelle had wandered into his office looking for tape for her robot project. His leather-bound notebook lay open on the desk. She hadn't meant to snoop, but the indentation on the page caught her eye. Running her finger lightly over the impression left from the previous page, she could make out the words, "Make sure they always feel chosen." The phrase stuck with her throughout the day. Why would Dad write that? Was he worried about something? Noelle watched him closely during their talent show, noticing the way he winced slightly when he laughed too hard, how he rubbed his left arm when he thought no one was looking. That night, long after the celebration ended, Jonathan moved silently through the hallway. He paused at each daughter's room, watching them sleep. In Zuri's room, surrounded by canvases and paintbrushes, she slept with her hands curled as if still holding a brush. In Imani's room, law books stacked neatly on her desk, she lay perfectly straight, her face serene but determined even in sleep. In Noelle's room, amid scattered gadgets and tools, she sprawled across the bed, one arm hanging off the edge. Jonathan sat in the hallway between their rooms, a small photo album open on his lap. He traced the outlines of their baby faces, remembering the day he first held each of them. "I'll protect this family until my last breath," he whispered to the quiet house, the weight of his secret diagnosis pressing against his chest like a stone. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Jonathan flipped pancakes at the stove. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his movements were slower than usual. When he heard footsteps, he straightened his posture and plastered on a bright smile. "Morning, sleepyheads," he called out as the girls shuffled in. Imani immediately noticed. "Dad, you look exhausted. Did you sleep at all?" Jonathan waved her concern away. "Just stayed up late finishing some boring paperwork. Nothing a little coffee won't fix." He flipped a pancake with an exaggerated flourish, nearly dropping it. "Ta-da! World's okayest chef at your service." The girls laughed, but Noelle's eyes narrowed. She watched her father's hands tremble slightly as he poured orange juice. When he winced, reaching for plates in the high cabinet, she exchanged a worried glance with Zuri. "Let me get those, Dad," Noelle said, jumping up to help. "Thanks, kiddo." Jonathan ruffled her hair. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." As they settled around the table for brunch, Jonathan cleared his throat dramatically. "So I've been thinking, you three are turning 16 next week." "Dad, we know when our birthday is," Imani said with a playful eye roll. "Yes, well, smarty pants, what you don't know is that I've planned something special." He paused for effect. "We're going to the city for 3 days. Hotel, shopping, museums, the works." The girls froze, forks midair. "The city? Like actual civilization with other humans?" Zuri asked, eyes wide. Jonathan nodded. "You're becoming young women. It's time you experienced more of the world than just our little bubble here." "But you always said," Imani began. "I know what I said," Jonathan interrupted gently. "But I can't protect you forever. You need to know the world you'll inherit." 2 days later, they checked into the Grand Plaza Hotel. The girls marveled at the soaring lobby ceiling while Jonathan spoke quietly with the concierge. They spent the afternoon at the Museum of Modern Art, where Zuri stood transfixed before paintings she'd only seen in books. That evening, as they exited a restaurant, a flash went off. Then another. A small group of photographers had gathered. "Mr. Blake, is it true you're stepping back into tech? Are these the famous daughters? Girls, how does it feel to be the charity case of the decade?" Jonathan quickly ushered them into a waiting car, his face tight with anger and worry. By morning, their faces were everywhere. Social media exploded with the hashtag #DaughtersBlakeDaughters. An old headline resurfaced and went viral. "The billionaire's stunt daughters. Where are they now?" Their private world had suddenly become very public. The next morning, the girls ventured into a small cafe near their hotel. As they waited in line, whispers followed them like shadows. "Those are the Blake charity cases," a woman murmured to her friend. "I read all about it online last night." Zuri stared at her shoes while Noelle pretended not to hear. Imani's jaw tightened. When they sat down with their drinks, a businessman at the next table kept glancing over, then typing furiously on his phone. Finally, he leaned toward them. "So which one of you is the tech genius trying to follow in Daddy's footsteps?" he asked with a smirk. "Or are you just enjoying the money?" Imani set her cup down with deliberate calm. "Sir, we're just having breakfast. Your assumptions about us say more about you than they do about us." The man's face reddened. "I was just making conversation." "No," Imani replied, her voice steady but firm. "You were making judgments. There's a difference." The cafe fell silent. The man gathered his things and left, muttering under his breath. "That was amazing," Noelle whispered, squeezing Imani's hand. That evening, Jonathan took them to a rooftop restaurant overlooking the glittering city. As they waited for dessert, he pointed to the skyline. "When I was about 8, he said, I was in a group home where the other kids teased me for reading all the time. Miss Dolores found me hiding in a closet one day." His eyes grew distant with memory. "She took me up to the roof and showed me the city view just like this one." "What did she tell you?" Zuri asked softly. Jonathan smiled. "She said, when people look down on you, build up higher." I didn't understand then, but later I realized she meant that other people's opinions only define you if you let them. Noelle leaned against his shoulder, like today at the cafe. "Exactly," Jonathan nodded proudly. "You three are already building higher than I ever could." The waiter brought a special birthday dessert with 3 candles. The girls clinked their glasses together in a toast. "To building higher," Imani declared. "To our future," added Zuri. "To family," Noelle finished. While the girls were distracted by the sparklers on their dessert, Jonathan quietly pressed his hand to his chest, wincing in pain. He took a small pill from his pocket and swallowed it quickly with water, forcing his smile back in place before they turned to him. "To family," he echoed, his voice slightly strained. "The most precious thing I've ever built." At midnight, Jonathan's eyes flew open, his chest burning with pain. Each breath felt like fire. Sweat dampened his pajamas as he clutched the edge of the nightstand, pulling himself to his feet. "Not now," he whispered, stumbling down the hallway toward his study. "Please, not yet." The house was silent except for his labored breathing. In his study, moonlight spilled across his desk where framed photos of the girls stood. Zuri with her first art award, Imani at debate camp, Noelle holding a robot she'd built. With trembling hands, Jonathan reached for his laptop and opened the camera. His face looked gray in the screen's glow. He pressed record. "My girls," he began, his voice breaking. "If you're watching this, He paused, fighting through another wave of pain. "I need you to know something important. Taking you home that day wasn't charity or a publicity stunt. It was..." Tears filled his eyes. "Tell them. They were the best decision of my life." Meanwhile, Zuri sat in her room staring at a canvas. The painting wouldn't come together. Something felt wrong, like a shadow hovering at the edge of her mind. She set down her brush and wandered into the hallway, drawn toward a faint light from her father's study. She heard a thud, then silence. "Dad?" she called, pushing the door open. Jonathan lay crumpled on the floor, his laptop still recording on the desk. "Dad!" Zuri screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Noelle! Imani! Help!" Footsteps pounded down the hall. Noelle and Imani burst into the room, their faces frozen in horror. "Call 911!" Imani shouted, kneeling beside their father. Noelle was already dialing, her hands shaking. "Dad, please!" Zuri sobbed, clutching his hand. "Please stay with us." Just then, sirens wailed in the distance. The ambulance had arrived within minutes, paramedics rushing in with equipment and a stretcher. Pulse is weak but steady, one said, attaching monitors. We need to move fast. As they lifted Jonathan onto the stretcher, his eyes fluttered open. He reached for the girls. My stars, he whispered. The paramedics wheeled him out to the ambulance. Without hesitation, the three sisters followed. We're coming with him, Imani told the paramedic, her voice leaving no room for argument. In the ambulance, the girls huddled together, holding each other's hands. No longer children, but young women united by fear. Zuri wept silently. Noelle stared at the monitor, tracking their father's heartbeat. Imani watched the paramedics work, memorizing every detail. Their hands formed an unbroken chain as the ambulance raced through the night, carrying the only parent they'd ever known toward an uncertain future. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Jonathan lay still, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that tracked his fragile heartbeat. The girls had barely left his side for 3 days. Zuri curled in a chair by the window, sketching her father's sleeping face. Noelle tinkered with a small device she'd built to alert them if his vitals changed. Imani paced, reading medical charts and questioning every nurse who entered. When exhaustion finally claimed Imani, she drifted into memories. She was 7, burning with fever, Jonathan's cool hand on her forehead. He'd canceled a major business meeting to sit beside her bed for 3 days straight. I'm sorry, little Imani had whispered. For what, sweetheart? Jonathan asked, surprised. For making you miss your important meeting. Jonathan had smiled, tucking the blanket around her. Nothing is more important than you girls. Nothing ever will be. Now Imani watched her father's chest rise and fall, the roles reversed. She gently adjusted his blanket, just as he had done for her countless times. I need coffee, Imani announced, stretching. Anyone want some? In the hospital cafeteria, Imani waited in line, her mind elsewhere. She didn't notice the woman approaching until she spoke. Excuse me, aren't you one of the Blake girls? Imani turned to see a woman with a recorder in hand, press badge visible. I'm doing a feature on your father, the journalist continued. Would you comment on what it's like, still being part of the Billionaire's social experiment after all these years? Imani's eyes narrowed. Social experiment? Well, you know, the woman gestured vaguely. The whole adoption thing. My father is fighting for his life upstairs, Imani said, her voice low but razor sharp. We are his daughters, not an experiment, not a charity case, not a story for your article. We're a family, and we deserve the same privacy any family would during a crisis. The journalist stepped back, surprised by her intensity. I'm sorry, I didn't mean… Yes, you did, Imani cut her off. But we stopped caring about what people like you think a long time ago. Back in Jonathan's room, Noelle was checking his phone for any messages from his doctors. Dad got a voicemail yesterday, she said, frowning at the screen. I should check it in case it's important. She pressed play and put it on speaker. A woman's voice filled the room, cool, composed, but with an undercurrent of urgency. Jonathan, this is Margaret. I heard you're sick. Call me before it's too late. The three sisters exchanged confused glances. Who's Margaret? Zuri asked. Noelle shook her head. I don't know. Dad never mentioned anyone named Margaret. The hospital room door swung open without warning. A tall woman with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun stepped in. Her expensive perfume filled the air as her heels clicked against the tile floor. Her face was a mask of cold calculation. So this is where Jonathan ended up, she said, her eyes barely glancing at the man in the bed before scanning the three young women. And these must be the charity cases. Noelle stood up first. Who are you? Margaret Blake, Jonathan's cousin and only living blood relative. She adjusted her designer blazer. And you three are the reason he threw away his legacy. Imani stepped forward, placing herself between Margaret and Jonathan's bed. We're his daughters. You need to leave. Margaret laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Daughters? Please. You don't even share his name. Just because he had some misguided savior complex doesn't make you family. Zuri, who had been quietly observing from her chair, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but firm. We're his daughters in every way that counts. He chose us." Margaret's lips curled into a cold smirk. How touching. But let's see what the law says about that. She pulled out her phone. "My lawyers have already filed an emergency injunction to freeze Jonathan's estate. Until he wakes up, if he wakes up, everything he owns is in limbo." "You can't do that," Noelle shouted. "I just did." Margaret glanced at Jonathan. "Blood is thicker than water, or adoption papers." As if on cue, commotion erupted in the hallway. Camera flashes lit up through the door's small window. Reporters called out questions, their voices muffled but growing louder. "What's happening?" Zuri asked, looking frightened. A nurse rushed in. "I'm sorry, but there are reporters everywhere. Someone tipped them off about Mr. Blake's condition and some kind of family dispute." Margaret smiled thinly. "That would be my press statement. The public deserves to know that Jonathan Blake's fortune is being hijacked by 3 girls with no real claim to his name." The hospital corridor was now filled with cameras and shouting voices. Security guards tried to maintain order, but the damage was done. Margaret had turned their private crisis into a public spectacle. "Get out," Imani said, her voice shaking with anger. "Get out now." "I'll be back," Margaret said, heading for the door. With a court order. Days turned into weeks as Jonathan remained unconscious. The hospital room became a second home to the sisters, who took shifts staying by his bedside. Zuri had brought in small paintings to brighten the sterile walls. Noelle rigged a better lighting system that wouldn't hurt their eyes during overnight stays. Imani kept meticulous notes of every doctor's visit and medication change. When they weren't at the hospital, they were meeting with lawyers in wood-paneled offices that smelled of old books and coffee. "She's filed similar claims before," said Mr. Thornton, their lead attorney, sliding a folder across the table to Imani. "Margaret Blake has a history of contesting wills and challenging family trusts." Imani flipped through the documents, her eyes widening. "She sued her own brother over their parents' estate, and her uncle before that?" "She's made quite a career out of family disputes," Mr. Thornton nodded. "Always claiming blood relation trumps all other considerations." That evening, Imani shared her findings with her sisters in the hospital cafeteria. "She's nothing but an opportunist," Imani said, her voice tight with anger. "She doesn't care about Dad. She just wants his money." Noelle slammed her fist on the table. "We should expose her, show everyone what she really is." Zuri, who had been quietly stirring her tea, finally spoke up. "Fighting hate with hate won't help Dad." She looked at her sisters with gentle determination. "We need to show the court what we already know. That family isn't about blood. It's about love and choice." "Zuri's right," Imani said, straightening her shoulders. "We need to prove our legitimacy through Dad's actions and intentions, not by tearing Margaret down." They returned to Jonathan's room with renewed purpose, each carrying the weight of their plan to protect what their father had built. It happened 3 days later. The sisters were sitting around Jonathan's bed, Noelle reading aloud from his book, The 3 Stars in the Sky, when his fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. "Dad?" Zuri whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Jonathan's eyes, though clouded with medication, focused on each of their faces. A faint smile touched his lips. "My girls," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Imani pressed the call button for the nurse while Noelle grabbed his hand. "Margaret's trying to take everything," Noelle blurted out. "She says we're not really family." Jonathan's face darkened with understanding. He squeezed Noelle's hand weakly. "Don't let her," he whispered, each word clearly taking effort. "Don't let her undo what we built." His eyes closed again, the brief moment of consciousness slipping away. But his words remained, giving the sisters the strength they needed for the battle ahead. Earlier that day, while Imani was meeting with lawyers and Noelle stayed with Jonathan, Zuri drove to the old orphanage alone. The building stood empty now, its windows boarded up and weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete steps. A condemned sign hung crookedly on the chain-link fence. Zuri slipped through a gap in the fence, her heart pounding. She'd come with purpose, to find anything that might help their case against Margaret. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that broke through the boards. The place felt smaller than in the few photos she'd seen of herself as a baby here. Zuri made her way to what had been the administrative office, guided by faded signs on the walls. Most of the filing cabinets were empty, their contents long removed. But in a forgotten drawer, she found a folder labeled Blake Adoption, 2002. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was her original intake record, a simple form noting 3 baby girls found abandoned. But beneath it lay something unexpected, a stack of visitor logs, each showing Jonathan Blake's signature month after month for 3 years before the adoption. "He came every month," she whispered, tracing the signatures with her finger. Then she found it, a letter from Jonathan's assistant to the orphanage director, dated 2 years before the adoption. "Mr. Blake wishes to continue his monthly visits with the 3 girls. He asks that this arrangement remain confidential. The enclosed donation is for their specific care needs." Zuri clutched the papers to her chest, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't a publicity stunt. Jonathan had chosen them long before anyone knew, before the cameras, before the headlines. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Noelle approached Margaret in the lobby. The older woman sat primly on a leather chair, typing on her laptop. "Can we talk?" Noelle asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "There must be some way to resolve this without hurting our father." Margaret looked up, her eyes cold. "Your father? Let's be realistic, dear." Jonathan made a charitable gesture that got out of hand. "He loved us," Noelle insisted. "He built a life for us." "He built an empire," Margaret corrected, closing her laptop. "An empire that should remain in the family. We are his family." Margaret's laugh was sharp. "Once I gain control, I'll be selling off most of the estate. The mansion will make an excellent corporate retreat center. The Blake Foundation will be repurposed under my direction, of course." Noelle stepped back, stunned by Margaret's naked greed. "This isn't about family for you at all, is it? It's just about money." When Zuri returned to the hospital, she found her sisters in the waiting room and spread the documents before them. "Look," she said, pointing to the visitor logs. "Dad came to see us every month for 3 years before he adopted us." Imani's eyes widened as she read the letter. This wasn't impulsive. He knew us. He chose us. "Long before the cameras saw us," Zuri added softly. The 3 sisters looked at each other, a new resolve forming between them. "We're not just fighting for his money," Noelle said. "We're fighting for his truth. And we'll win," Imani added, "not just with lawyers, but with love." The morning sun painted golden streaks across the hospital waiting room as Imani straightened her blazer and checked her watch. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours, but determination kept her alert. The estate attorney, Mr. Hernandez, had agreed to meet her at this early hour to avoid press attention. "Miss Blake," he said, extending his hand as he approached. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the light. "I've reviewed your father's documents." They sat in a quiet corner, voices low. "Your father's will is solid," Mr. Hernandez explained, spreading papers between them. "The adoption was legal, his intentions are clear, and you 3 are his rightful heirs." Imani felt a moment of relief, but it faded as the attorney continued. "However, Margaret's claim of undue influence is troubling. She's suggesting Jonathan wasn't of sound mind when he adopted you, that it was an emotional reaction rather than a rational choice." "That's ridiculous," Imani whispered fiercely. "He loved us for years before the public knew anything." "I believe you," Mr. Hernandez said gently, "but Margaret knows how to manipulate public opinion, and in cases like this, perception can influence judges, even when the law is on your side." Imani nodded, her jaw tight. "Then we'll fight on both fronts, legal and public." Across town, Zuri stood before a massive blank canvas in her studio. Sunlight streamed through the windows as she mixed colors with determined strokes. The gallery owner, Ms. Chen, watched from the doorway. "You're sure you want to do this exhibition now?" Ms. Chen asked. "With everything happening?" "I've never been more sure," Zuri replied, making the first bold stroke across the canvas. "This piece is called Chosen." The painting took shape. 3 small silhouettes against a backdrop of countless stars, with larger hands sheltering them. The symbolism was clear, but powerful. "We'll announce the fundraiser for abandoned children tomorrow," Ms. Chen said, snapping a photo of the work in progress. "It's already generating interest." Meanwhile, in the hospital's family room, Noelle sat with a journalist she'd known since college, Sofia Rivera from the Daily Chronicle. "Are you sure about this?" Sofia asked, setting up her recorder. Noelle nodded, connecting her laptop to the TV screen. The world should see the truth. She pressed play on a video montage, Jonathan teaching them to ride bikes, reading bedtime stories, attending science fairs and art shows. Birthday celebrations, holiday mornings, everyday moments filled with love. "He wasn't perfect," Noelle explained as the footage played, "but he chose us every single day, not just when the cameras were watching." Sofia wiped away a tear. "This will change everything, Noelle." "That's the plan," Noelle replied, sending the video file to Sofia's email. "The truth deserves to go viral." The beeping of the heart monitor changed its rhythm as Jonathan's eyes fluttered open. Unlike his brief awakening days earlier, this time his gaze was clear and focused. He immediately tried to sit up, causing the nurse to rush to his side. "Mr. Blake, please, you need to rest," she urged, but Jonathan was already pulling at the IV in his arm. "My daughters need me," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "I need to be discharged." The doctor arrived moments later, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Blake, I strongly advise against this. Your condition is less important than what's happening to my family," Jonathan interrupted. "I'm signing whatever papers you need. I'm leaving today." Imani, who had been dozing in the corner chair, jumped up. "Dad, you can't." But the look in Jonathan's eyes, a mixture of love and fierce resolve, silenced her protest. She knew that expression all too well. 3 hours later, Jonathan sat in his home office, pale but composed as his longtime lawyer recorded him on camera. Zuri, Imani, and Noelle stood behind him, their hands resting supportively on his shoulders. "I, Jonathan Blake, being of sound mind," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "hereby declare this my final will and testament, superseding all previous versions." He named each daughter individually, his voice filled with pride as he detailed their strengths and contributions. "To Imani Blake, I leave Blake Legal Solutions and all associated properties. To Zuri Blake, Blake Media and Arts Foundation. To Noelle Blake, Blake Tech Innovations." His lawyer nodded approvingly as Jonathan continued. "And I explicitly exclude Margaret Blake from any inheritance or control of my companies, properties, or personal effects, now and in perpetuity." The lawyer stopped recording and immediately began preparing the documents for court submission. "This will stand up, Jonathan. I'll file it within the hour." Just as the lawyer was leaving, Noelle's phone buzzed with notifications. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the messages. "Dad, everyone's talking about Margaret," she said, turning her phone so they could all see. "Someone hacked and leaked her emails. She was on the committee that tried to shut down our orphanage 20 years ago." The leaked emails showed Margaret had advocated for closing financially draining orphanages, specifically targeting the one where the girls had been found. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. "She didn't just want to take our inheritance," Zuri whispered. "She tried to erase our beginning." Jonathan reached for his daughter's hands. "But she failed then, and she'll fail now." The courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge adjusted her glasses, carefully reviewing the newly submitted evidence. The leaked emails painted a damning picture of Margaret's past actions against the very orphanage where the Blake sisters had once been abandoned. Margaret rose from her seat, her perfectly tailored suit unable to mask her growing desperation. "Your Honor, this is all being taken out of context. Jonathan is confused and ill. His condition has clouded his judgment about these girls." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "That's enough, Ms. Blake. The court will determine Mr. Blake's competency, not you." Margaret's mouth snapped shut as Imani approached the stand. Though only 16, she carried herself with the poise of someone twice her age. She placed a thick binder on the stand and opened it methodically. Your Honor, I've compiled a timeline of our family's history, Imani said, her voice clear and steady. These are receipts showing our father visited us monthly for 3 years before adoption. Here are testimonials from our teachers, doctors, and neighbors who witnessed his dedication to us. As Imani spoke, Zuri wheeled in a large canvas covered with a cloth. When Imani finished, Zuri stepped forward. "This is called Chosen," she said softly, pulling away the cloth. The painting revealed 3 small black girls standing in a circle of light, with shadowy hands reaching toward them from all directions. But the most prominent hand, painted in warm, protective colors, sheltered them from above. The detail was exquisite. Each girl's face reflected a different emotion: hope, determination, and joy. The courtroom fell completely silent. Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. Jonathan, who had been sitting quietly at the defense table, slowly rose to his feet. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge nodded, and Jonathan made his way to the stand, his steps careful but determined. 20 years ago, I saw 3 little girls that the world had forgotten, he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. Not for publicity or tax breaks, as some have suggested. I saw them because I had once been them, alone, unwanted, until someone chose me. He looked directly at his daughters, his eyes shining with emotion. Fatherhood isn't defined by DNA. It's defined by midnight fevers and first steps. It's defined by wiping tears and celebrating victories. It's the choice you make every single day to put someone else's happiness before your own. Jonathan turned to face Margaret. Family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who chooses to love you anyway. The gallery erupted in emotion. Sniffles and quiet sobs filled the room. Even the court reporter paused to dab at her eyes. The courtroom erupted into applause as the judge's gavel came down with finality. The court finds in favor of Jonathan Blake and his daughters. All claims by Margaret Blake are dismissed with prejudice. Margaret's face twisted with rage as she gathered her papers. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she brushed him off and stormed toward the exit, escorted by a court officer. Outside on the courthouse steps, cameras flashed as Zuri, Imani, and Noel embraced each other tightly, their faces wet with tears of relief. The press, once hostile, now cheered as they captured the moment of victory. Reporters shouted questions, their tone dramatically changed from skepticism to admiration. "How does it feel to have your family recognized?" called one journalist. Imani stepped forward, her voice steady despite her emotion. "It feels like the truth finally came to light. We've always been a family. Now the world sees it too." Jonathan watched from his wheelchair at the top of the steps, an oxygen tube in his nose, but pride radiating from his tired face. Though physically weakened, his eyes shone with unmistakable joy as he observed his daughters handling the press with grace and confidence. "Mr. Blake," a reporter asked, "what's next for Blake Technologies now that your daughters are confirmed as your heirs?" Jonathan smiled and gestured for his daughters to join him. When they gathered around his wheelchair, he spoke clearly into the microphones. "These young women aren't just the adopted ones anymore. They're the future of everything I've built. Imani's legal mind, Zuri's artistic vision, and Noel's technical genius will take Blake Technologies further than I ever could alone." The girls stood tall beside him, no longer children hiding from the world, but young women ready to embrace their legacy. That evening, back at their countryside estate, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. The table was set with candles and their favorite foods, a celebration away from the cameras and noise. Zuri carefully hung her chosen painting above the fireplace, stepping back to make sure it was perfectly centered. "There," she said softly. "Now it's home." Jonathan wheeled himself closer to admire it. The candlelight made the colors dance across the canvas, bringing the 3 girls in the painting to life. "In all my years," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion, "with all the rare art and technology patents I've owned, this is the most valuable thing I've ever possessed." The girls gathered around him, their hands on his shoulders as they gazed at the painting that told their story. A story of being chosen, of being loved, of becoming a family against all odds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as memories washed over Jonathan. His mind drifted back to a cold December day nearly 40 years ago. A skinny 10-year-old boy sat crying on the hospital steps. His foster parents, having abandoned him after a routine checkup, revealed he needed expensive medication. "What's your name, little one?" The voice was warm like honey, with a musical quality that made young Jonathan look up through his tears. Miss Dolores stood there in her crisp white nurse's uniform, her dark skin glowing in the winter sunlight. She knelt down, not minding the dirty steps, and gently lifted his chin. "Jonathan," he whispered, his voice cracking. She smiled and took his small hand in hers. "Well, Jonathan, seems to me you've been left alone. But you won't be alone forever." She lifted him up, her strong arms cradling him with unexpected tenderness. "One day you'll change someone else's life. That's why God keeps special souls like you around." The memory faded as Jonathan's wheelchair rolled to a stop on the grassy hill of Oakwood Cemetery. The girls stood behind him, solemn and respectful in their Sunday best. "This is her," Jonathan said softly, gesturing to the simple headstone. "Dolores Washington. She was the first person who made me believe I mattered." Zuri placed a hand on her father's shoulder as Imani and Noel stood beside her. The headstone was modest, but well-maintained, with fresh flowers already in the vase. Jonathan had been sending weekly arrangements for 20 years. "She saved my life," Jonathan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just by getting me medical care, but by showing me that family isn't always blood." Each girl stepped forward with a single rose. Zuri placed hers first, followed by Imani, and then Noel. Jonathan wheeled forward last, placing his rose in the center. "Thank you," he whispered to the stone, "for being the reason I believed in second chances." The family bowed their heads in a moment of silent gratitude. As they drove home through the countryside, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Noel, sitting beside her father in the back seat, broke the contemplative silence. "This story started before we were born, didn't it?" she asked, her eyes thoughtful as she looked at Jonathan. Jonathan smiled, taking her hand in his. "Yes," he said, glancing at each of his daughters, "but you three gave it an ending worth living for." The marble floors of Blake Enterprises headquarters gleamed as Jonathan wheeled into the boardroom, flanked by his three daughters. The board members stood nervously, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan announced, his voice still commanding despite his weakened state, "meet the future of this company." The board members exchanged glances as Imani stepped forward in her tailored navy suit, her posture confident and her gaze unwavering. "Imani will be heading our foundation arm," Jonathan said proudly. "Her legal mind and passion for justice make her perfect to oversee how we give back." Zuri came next, her artist's eyes taking in the room with quiet intensity. "Zuri will lead creative innovation, bringing heart to our technology through design that speaks to the soul." Finally, Noel stepped up, her smile bright but determined. "And Noel will pioneer our youth tech initiatives, creating pathways for underprivileged children to access education and opportunity." One board member cleared his throat. "Mr. Blake, with all due respect." "With all due respect," Imani interrupted gently, "we've been studying this company since we were children. Our father made sure we understood not just what it does, but what it could do." The room fell silent, impressed by her poise. 2 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel sparkled with chandeliers and camera flashes. The annual Blake Foundation Gala had drawn celebrities, business leaders, and philanthropists from across the country. At its center stood Zuri's masterpiece, Chosen, a massive canvas depicting 3 small figures bathed in light, reaching toward a solitary hand. "The bidding for Chosen starts at $1 million, the auctioneer announced. Hands shot up across the room. $2 million, $3 million, $5 million, called a voice from the back. The crowd turned to see Gregory Vance, Jonathan's former business partner, holding his paddle high. When the gavel fell, Zuri's eyes glistened with tears. $5 million would help thousands of children like she and her sisters once were. As the crowd mingled afterward, a woman approached Imani. She was a well-known columnist who had once written a scathing piece titled, Blake's charity case children. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice low. "I called you a billionaire's side project. I was wrong." Imani studied her for a moment, then smiled. "We were never a project," she said kindly but firmly. "We were the purpose." Jonathan watched from across the room, his heart swelling with pride as his daughters stood tall, not as symbols or statements, but as the leaders they were born to be. The winter morning was crisp and bright as the three Blake sisters pulled up to the renovated building. What was once a crumbling orphanage now stood proud and welcoming, its fresh paint gleaming in the sunlight. A new sign hung over the entrance: the Blake Home for Hope. "Can you believe it's been 20 years? Zuri whispered, her artist's eyes taking in every detail of the transformation. Imani squeezed her hand. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday." Noelle bounced on her toes, excitement radiating from her as always. "Come on, the kids are waiting." As they walked through the doors, the contrast to their memories was stark. Warm colors replaced institutional gray. Children's artwork lined the hallways. Laughter echoed where silence once ruled. The director, Ms. Winters, greeted them with a warm hug. "They've been counting down the days," she said, leading them to the main activity room. The moment they entered, a chorus of excited voices erupted. Children of all ages rushed forward, some shy, others bold, all wearing T-shirts with the Blake Foundation logo, 3 stars in a night sky. Noelle knelt down, high-fiving each child. "Who wants to see some cool tech?" she asked, pulling out a small robot from her bag. The children gathered around, eyes wide with wonder. Later, Noelle stood before the assembled group, her usual energy channeled into something more serious. 20 years ago, my sisters and I were right where you are," she began. "People said we wouldn't amount to much. They were wrong." She looked at each child's face. "The world might doubt you. Sometimes you might doubt yourself. But remember this: stars shine brightest in the darkest sky." Across the room, Zuri had set up a mural project. Children dipped brushes in vibrant colors, adding their touches to her outline, 3 bright stars rising over a peaceful hillside. "That's us," a little girl said, pointing to the stars. "Yes," Zuri smiled. "And maybe you too." While the children painted, the sisters slipped away to a quiet corner of the building. They knew exactly where to go, the back room where they had once been left, bundled together. The space was now a cozy reading nook, but they remembered. Imani reached into her bag and pulled out 3 hand-knitted blankets, each one soft and colorful. On each was a hand-sewn label, "For the next stars." They placed them gently on the window seat, tears flowing freely now. "Full circle," Imani whispered. "But not the end of the story," Zuri added. "Just the beginning of a new chapter," Noelle finished, as they embraced in the spot where their journey had begun. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Jonathan Blake sat in his wheelchair, watching his daughters on the flat-screen TV. His hair had turned silver, his face lined with age, but his eyes remained bright with pride. The 3 women he'd raised sat poised and confident on the national morning show, their presence commanding respect. "So tell us," the host asked, leaning forward, "what's the most important lesson your father taught you?" Imani, elegant in a tailored suit, spoke first. "Dignity," she said firmly. "Dad showed us how to hold our heads high when the world tried to make us feel small. He taught us that our worth wasn't determined by others' opinions." Zuri, her artist's soul evident in her colorful dress, nodded. "Love," she added softly. "Not just receiving it, but giving it freely, even when it's hard. Dad chose us every single day, even when it cost him everything." Noelle, vibrant as always, completed their thoughts. "Legacy. He showed us that what matters isn't what you build, but who you build it for. We weren't his biological children, but we were always his purpose." Jonathan wiped a tear from his cheek as the camera panned across his daughters' faces, the faces of women who had defied every expectation. Later that afternoon, Jonathan sat at his desk, the manuscript before him. "They laughed until they saw them fly" was embossed on the leather cover. With a trembling hand, he signed the final page, completing the story of their family. He ran his fingers over the words he'd written, years of memories captured in ink. The book wasn't just his story, it was theirs, a testament to what love could build from nothing. "It's done," he whispered to himself, tears welling in his eyes. Not just the book, but the journey. He had given them roots, and now they had wings. That evening, the family gathered in the living room. The fireplace crackled, casting a warm glow over the four of them. Jonathan's wheelchair was positioned at the head of their small circle. "I have something for each of you," he said, his voice soft but steady. From beside his chair, he lifted 3 wrapped packages. One by one, his daughters unwrapped identical copies of his memoir. Each book was personally inscribed with a message only for them. "This is yours now," Jonathan said, his eyes moving from Zuri to Imani to Noel. "Our story. But the pen is in your hands for what comes next. Write your next chapter." The sisters held their books against their hearts, the weight of his words settling over them. It wasn't goodbye. It was a passing of the torch. The evening sky turned a rich purple as dozens of lanterns were lit across the Blake estate lawn. A long table draped in white linen stretched beneath the oak trees, adorned with wildflowers and candles that flickered in the gentle breeze. Jonathan's birthday celebration had drawn people from all corners of their lives, some who had stood by them from the beginning, others who had once been their harshest critics. Dr. Harriet Winters, who had once publicly questioned Jonathan's motives for adoption, now raised her glass in a toast. Gregory Vance, the former business partner who had once betrayed them, sat quietly at the far end, humbled by time and truth. Even several board members who had resigned in protest 20 years ago had returned with apologies and admiration. "Look at how things change," Zuri whispered to Noel as they watched their father receiving well wishes from people who once mocked him. Jonathan sat in his wheelchair at the head of the table, his daughters surrounding him like a protective circle. The years had weakened his body but strengthened the light in his eyes. He nodded gratefully at each person who approached, but his gaze kept returning to Imani, Zuri, and Noel, his greatest pride. As the dessert was being served, Jonathan whispered something to Imani. She nodded and motioned to Noel. The two sisters moved to either side of his wheelchair. "May I have everyone's attention?" Imani called out, her voice carrying across the lawn. The crowd fell silent as Jonathan gripped the arms of his wheelchair. Slowly, with Imani and Noel supporting him on each side, he rose to his feet. A collective gasp rippled through the gathering. It had been months since anyone had seen Jonathan stand. "I wanted to look you all in the eye tonight," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "Because I have everything I never dared to hope for." His gaze swept across the faces before settling on his daughters. "And I owe it all to the day I heard 3 cries in a corner." Tears flowed freely among the guests. Zuri moved forward to join her sisters in supporting their father. "They said I was crazy," Jonathan continued, "to think 3 abandoned girls could become my legacy. But look at them now. Look at us now." Just then, the first firework exploded overhead, bathing the lawn in gold light. More followed, red, blue, green, illuminating the night sky in a spectacular display that Noel had secretly arranged. As Jonathan was gently returned to his wheelchair, the 3 sisters moved to the center of the lawn. They joined hands and began to dance in a circle, their laughter rising above the music. More guests joined them, the celebration growing into a joyful gathering that spread across the entire estate. From a distance, the Blake home glowed like a beacon in the darkness, windows lit, lawn shimmering with lanterns, fireworks painting the sky above. What had once been a silent mansion, built to hide from the world, now pulsed with life and joy. In her darkened penthouse apartment, Margaret Blake sat alone, staring at the television as it showed the glowing celebration at the Blake estate. Her face hardened as the camera panned across Jonathan in his wheelchair, surrounded by his daughters. Their laughter felt like a personal affront to her. "Ridiculous," she muttered, jabbing the remote to turn off the screen. The sudden silence was deafening. Margaret stood up from her leather armchair and moved to leave the room, but something made her pause. On a nearly empty bookshelf stood a single framed photograph, faded with age but still clear enough to make out two children smiling on a swing set. Jonathan and Margaret, barely 10 years old, before life had pulled them in different directions. Her fingers hovered over the frame but didn't touch it. For a brief moment, her eyes softened as she stared at the boy who had once been her closest friend. She turned away without taking the photo, leaving it as the sole personal item in an otherwise sterile home. Meanwhile, across the country, Zuri stood on a circular red carpet, bathed in spotlight as she addressed a packed auditorium. Behind her, a massive screen displayed the title of her talk, "We Are Who We Choose to Love." "Family isn't defined by matching DNA or shared last names," she said, her voice steady and warm. "It's built in the moment someone chooses you, again and again, even when it's hard." As she spoke, the audience leaned forward in their seats. Many wiped away tears when she showed childhood photos of Jonathan learning to braid her hair, reading bedtime stories, and attending her first art show. "The greatest act of love is choosing someone when the world says you shouldn't," Zuri concluded. "My father chose us, and now we choose to extend that same love to others." Within hours, clips of her talk flooded social media. Comments poured in from around the world. "Just signed up to be a foster parent after watching this. As an adopted child, thank you for giving me words for what I've always felt. Started the paperwork to adopt my foster daughter today." Across town, Imani stood before a group of judges and attorneys, unveiling the Blake Justice Initiative, a program providing legal representation to foster children and orphans navigating the system. "No child should face the courts alone," she declared, her voice carrying the same conviction that had won her the landmark case against Margaret. At the same time, Noelle was demonstrating her new app to a group of tech investors. "Connect Kids links orphaned youth with mentors in their dream fields," she explained, showing how the platform had already matched hundreds of children with professionals willing to guide them. Back at the estate, Jonathan watched live streams of all three events on separate tablets, his eyes filled with tears as he witnessed the ripple effects of what his daughters had created. "This," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion, "this is the empire. Not stocks or buildings or bank accounts, but lives changed, hearts healed, and a legacy of love that would outlast any fortune he could have amassed." The autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the sprawling estate as Jonathan Blake sat on the wide porch, wrapped in a soft wool blanket despite the mild temperature. At 82, his body had grown frail, but his eyes remained sharp and clear as they followed the movement of three little girls playing tag across the lawn. "Grandpa, watch this!" called out 5-year-old Maya, Zuri's daughter, as she attempted a wobbly cartwheel. Jonathan chuckled softly. "Magnificent," he called back, his voice thinner than it once was, but still carrying the warmth that had defined him as a father. Beside Maya, Imani's daughter Dolores, named after the nurse who had once saved Jonathan's life, was carefully organizing pine cones into precise rows. At 6, she already showed her mother's methodical mind and sense of justice. A few feet away, Noelle's 4-year-old Johnny, Johanna officially, but no one called her that, was taking apart a toy truck to see how it worked. 3 stars, Jonathan whispered to himself, his heart so full it ached. Inside the house, voices and laughter mingled with the smell of a home-cooked meal. Through the open door, Jonathan could see into the living room where the original painting, Chosen, hung above the fireplace, Zuri's masterpiece that had helped turn the tide in their legal battle years ago. The painting had only grown more beautiful with time, its colors deepening to show 3 bright stars rising above a shadowed landscape. Beneath it, a simple bronze plaque gleamed in the firelight. "The family they never saw coming." Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the sounds of his family wash over him. Imani discussing a case with her husband, Noelle laughing at something Zuri said, the delighted squeals of his granddaughters on the lawn. The weight of his accomplishments, not his billions or his companies, but the family he had built, settled around him like a comfortable embrace. As twilight painted the sky in purples and deep blues, Jonathan's chin dipped toward his chest, his breathing growing slow and even. The peace on his face was profound, his lips curved in a gentle smile. "Dad," Zuri called from the garden path. "Dinner's ready. We're all waiting for you." Jonathan's eyes fluttered open and he let out a soft chuckle. "Coming," he called back, slowly rising from his chair with the help of his cane. His daughters had prepared his favorite meal, and his granddaughters were waiting to tell him about their day. This moment, this family, was everything. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan, Imani, Noel, and Zuri, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. This moment, this family, was everything. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan, Imani, Noel, and Zuri, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.